Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for having me here. My short speech, I'll try to keep it short. I normally tend to overdo my time on stage, but I'm trying to keep it short as you're all waiting for lunch break. However, the subject of my master's thesis on University of Krems for game-based media and education, which I just finished a few weeks ago. So this is rather fresh work, and I'm just trying to give you a short overview of what I've been doing here. And I've taken for this speech today the gamer's perspective, as transmedia is generally about media as a whole, but I've tried to take a bit of a gamer's perspective for today's speech. Just a few words about myself. My name is Moeller, as I've already been introduced. I was born in 1969 in Vienna, Austria, still live there. And I'm married, and I'm actually working as a software developer and a cloud architect. So I'm not in the gaming industry or in the multimedia industry. I'm a freelancer when it comes to these studies. I originally did applied linguistics at the University of Vienna, also not working there. And here, as I've already been introduced as this, I finished applied game studies in, I think, 2015 and game-based media and education in 2022. Okay, that's it about me. And about my work for game-based media and education, I was researching incoherences and frictions or breaks in transmedia storytelling. What am I talking about here? Anybody remember this? The controversy about ugly Sonic versus lovely Sonic. Those of you who don't know what I'm talking about here, Sonic the Hedgehog was filmed, or a film was made about Sonic the Hedgehog in 2020. And in, I think, 2019, the first trailer was released online on YouTube, starring this Sonic here, which led to a rather big shitstorm about the character itself and its visual appearance. Nobody had expected Sonic to look this way. He was way too anthropomorphic for many people. Others complained about him being spooky or not the Sonic they had expected. And what happened, in fact, was, I think the film was done by Universal Pictures, but I'm not really sure about that. Anyway, what they did was they redesigned the creature for the movie. And in the second trailer and on the silver screen, this was the Sonic that was finally used. So what happened here? And this is what I'm researching. What happened here to the audience? To the audience, this Sonic was just not what they had expected, because everybody was used to a Sonic looking like this. And if you, as the creators or as the creative team of a franchise, and Sonic the Hedgehog is pretty much a big franchise nowadays, if you create content, there are certain rules you have to follow. Otherwise, you may run into problems by presenting a Sonic nobody had expected. So this is a rather superficial, but still very prominent example. It did the movie good that they redesigned Sonic, because it was a huge success, maybe also because of this controversy that went through pretty much all media. I think there was even an article on Standard in Austria about this. They even did a sequel, and that Jim Carrey was actually the main actor in this movie. Nobody cared about that. Everybody talked about the Sonic creature. And well, this is one example for what I refer to as a divergence, because there is a difference between what people got and what people had expected within a franchise. Another much more prominent example is this. I suppose some of you have seen at least one of those movies, and perhaps one or the other was a bit annoyed by the presentation of storyline and characters in Star Wars: The Last Jedi and Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. I don't want to get into too much detail, because this is not really about gaming. But anyway, what happened here was a new movie was released in 2015. To everybody's expectations, it was pretty much more of the same, but it was a decent Star Wars story. pretty much everybody was happy with it. Critics were happy with it. It got decent reviews, and the audience loved the movie. 2 years later, The Last Jedi was released, and this movie treated things a bit differently. And if you remember the movie, if you've seen the movie, you may remember that the first part built up to one big scene where the lead actress, Rey, or the lead character Rey, handed over a lightsaber to the up till then that point hidden away character of Luke Skywalker. I mean, he's pretty much the main character, the main protagonist of the whole Star Wars saga, at least starting from part 4. Handing over the lightsaber, end of movie. Episode 8 starts. Everybody's expecting Luke to take the reins and do whatever. What he actually did, if you remember, he took the lightsaber and threw it over his shoulder. Well, this is just one point where they tried to undermine people's expectations with this movie. It might have worked had that movie not derailed on so many other parts or details, which, if you follow the discussion online, are becoming more and more prominent. And The Last Jedi was, I call it, a daring example of a fail within the Star Wars universe. There are even online petitions to strike out all 3 of the new Star Wars movies from Star Wars continuity. So what happened here? Finally, LucasArts, or more or less Disney, had to pretty much undo everything that had been done in The Last Jedi and come up with a rather lukewarm final part of the final trilogy of the Skywalker saga. And if you look up online critics, you will see that critics loved these 2 movies and the audience loved this one. And The Rise of Skywalker is now, I think it received 56 on Tomatoes and other Metacritic platforms. And this is the main point. It was the last movie we've seen so far. Everything is now currently going towards streaming. And this is the last movie for what I consider to be a rather long time we're going to see in cinemas. Well, okay, this is Disney. The other one was Paramount. These are large-scale companies creating multi-million-dollar French or Euro franchises. And if a film doesn't perform as well as they'd expected, well, who cares? But we do care, and this is something now from the gaming industry, and this is a positive example, the Battlestar Galactica games. But let's just focus once more on this. We care because not every franchise is this big. Franchises start with a small idea, with one idea that hopefully creates content, that hopefully creates a franchise. And if you create something, you create a rule set together with the world you build up, especially if you're in science fiction or fantasy where many games are being set. And this is the example of Battlestar Galactica where they did things right. But if it was really to push the product, well, we can talk about this. Anybody seen the new Galactica series from 2004? Okay, those who remember it will remember that in contrast to what we know from movie franchises like Star Wars, where fighters and dogfights are normally flown in a parabolic curve, fighters in Battlestar Galactica tend to move in zero gravity and in open space the way they can by just reversing in full flight. This is a totally different approach towards dogfight in space. It's depicted in the Battlestar Galactica show in multiple times, and it's also a main part of the game design of this combat simulation that was released, I think, in 2006. Totally accurate, works within the world, so there is no breach between the serious world and the game world, but rather hard to play, which hurt the game because Everybody loved the design. Everybody loved the looks of the game and the overall design of the game, but it was too hard for, I think, 99% of the players. I played it myself. I couldn't finish it. And I was, at that time, 20 years ago, I was rather good at dogfighting simulations, but I was unable to finish this game. So accuracy worked within the design, but maybe when the designers of the new Battlestar Galactica show were planning on having a game designed in the first place, they might have thought differently about how they depict the dogfight in the show. Because otherwise, if they had depicted dogfights in the game as we are used to from Star Wars, or Star Trek doesn't have dogfighters, but generally as we're used to it, people might have complained about why isn't that ship moving the way it does within the show. And this is where a fraction did not happen, was prevented, but on the cost of too hard gameplay. Well, things are getting complicated. As you can see here, you have to think about when you try to make your own universe for your gaming environment, for your serial environment, for whatever kind of creative work you are proposing. In the old days, and I count the first Star Wars movies, as well as perhaps things that were surfacing around the 2000s, as then the old days, we were talking about when you created something, one product, one movie, one game, one TV show. Nowadays, when you propose something to investors, one of the first things you're going to be asked is, how do we franchise this? Because pretty much everything today becomes a franchise. Because every TV show, every big TV show, every movie is followed by plans for a sequel. You've seen Sonic was sequel 2 years after the first movie. And this, of course, was already part of Transmedia Universe. Prequels, everybody knows the Star Wars prequels. Everybody knows the now very popular Star Trek prequel shows, parallel universes, again, Star Wars, Star Trek, alternate timelines, JJ Trek from Star Trek. So things are getting complicated because everybody wants to make profit, and these worlds, when they run into issues with the established history, they try to come up with something, parallel universe, alternate timelines, you name it. Of course, there is commerce. Everybody wants to make profit with a movie. Nobody produces a game to lose money. Nobody does that. But sometimes you try to be creative. And if you're creative, you're limited by what was done before you. So, for example, the game you've seen, the Galactica game, was limited by the decisions made by the creative team originally proposing the TV show. And you do need a certain amount of control for things not to derail. And this is what I'm referring to here, because when you let loose for your creative team, things like we've seen in Star Wars in the last movies can happen. Creative teams create new content that does not really fit into the continuity of the shows or of the universe. And if you don't control it, and if you're not Disney or Paramount or 20th Century Fox, your franchise may be dead before you know it. So if you start a new idea, you have to think about the things that you wish to do in the future. Because if you propose a universe, and I have a gaming example where this becomes rather prominent later on. If you create a universe and you want this universe to continue over time, you need to think about how this universe works and not just how one setting works. But we'll talk about this later. And in my master thesis, I proposed two concepts: the concept of coherence. Well, this is what I wrote in my master thesis. You can read it if you want. It mainly means a universe is coherent if things work. If things are harmonious and in place, and you as the audience are not irritated by the things happening on screen, like I was when watching Star Wars Episode 8. I was, by some things, I was rather annoyed, but we can talk about this later on. Don't want to get into too much of detail about this movie. Well, if coherence is violated, so if something happens, this is what I used to call a friction. And the friction, well, it's pretty much when the harmony of a universe is disturbed. It can happen within one media, so from one movie to the next, or even within a movie, or within one game. If, for example, your main character changed skin color from one moment to the next, I mean, that's a rather harsh example, but we've seen things like that. This is an incoherence or a friction. It can happen between your lead or main media and secondary media. For example, in the movie, fighters move along parabolic curves. In the game, fighters move differently. And also between several secondary media. If you remember Star Wars again, we have comic books, we have games, we have movies, we have TV shows, we have pretty much everything. Novels, we have pretty much everything. And there have been contradictions in the past. And nowadays, when everything is analyzed through social media and everybody has an opinion on everything, you run into problems rather quickly. 20, 25 years, 30 years ago, this wasn't really an issue. There have been TV shows in the 70s where they changed pretty much everything from setting to actors to the general purpose of the show between seasons 1 and 2. Nobody cared. Today, nobody watches. And when things like that happen, I call it divergence. And the divergence is pretty much the occurrence of any kind of contextual friction within a narrative universe. So if anything breaks up, that's a divergence. It irritates. So you're sitting in a cinema, you're watching the movie, you're sitting at home, and you think, what the hell? What's going on? This is irritation, this is divergence. And it harms your franchise because Star Wars, Disney, they did have the resources to fix things up somehow. You don't, we don't. If we create something that doesn't work, we did. We have to come up with something new if we get a second chance. So we as creators, we as creative people, we need to think about these things if we plan big. If you're only planning for one book, for one game, for one movie, and that's it, you can do pretty much what you want. But if you want a larger picture, if you want a larger franchise, you have to think about things before doing them. One example, I will cut it really short, where one iteration hurt another was Judge Dredd. Anybody seen those movies? This one? You know what the main criticism about this movie is? Anybody know that? The face. Because in the Judge Dredd comic books from 2008, which is a British production, these comic books exist since I think 1979 or whatever. Judge Dredd never shows his face. This is rule number 1 in the Judge Dredd universe. Well, and then they did a picture with Sylvester Stallone in the lead role, I think in 1995, and this is Sylvester Stallone, and you can't have a Sylvester Stallone movie without Sylvester Stallone showing his face, and he does that about 15 minutes into the movie. And everybody said, well, that's not Judge Dredd. Okay, so this was 1995. I think the movie still did okay, but no sequel was produced. The movie franchise was dead after that. Okay, and now we have this one. Anybody seen that? Yeah. You know, in this picture, Dredd is presented pretty much the way you expect it to be. I think this is a 95% Judge Dredd movie. There are some details, but generally this is really, really good, and it bombed. Why? Because of this movie. Because people, and there has been a little research on that, because they tried to find out what went wrong here. The general audience looked Judge Dredd movies up on YouTube, found the old trailers, found out that was originally a Sylvester Stallone movie. People criticized it. This is not really Judge Dredd, and the new movie didn't really get a chance because it wasn't a really big production. They didn't have too much financing for promotion. And the new movie, although it was really, in my opinion, it was really good, it was hurt by a movie done 20 years before, because this movie made a huge mistake within the Judge Dredd universe. So, and this is Carl Urban, by the way. This is not an unknown actor playing the character. This is a character, and at that time, Urban was already at least a very well-known star within the science fiction community, because he already was Dr. McCoy in the new Star Trek movies. So this is not a nobody playing Dredd, but you don't even have his name on the poster. They just relied on Dredd being this time done for real, but this is what hurt the franchise. And there are several, and I'm trying to cut this short because I think I'm already way over time. Okay, there are certain levels of divergences I identified in the course of my master thesis. We're talking mainly about form and content level divergences. Form level means if there is any friction or divergence based on optical, acoustic, or production-based criteria within the movie, then this is a formal divergence. What do I mean by this? For example, let's go back to Star Wars Episode 8. I mentioned there are certain franchises where dogfights happen in certain ways, like in parabolic flight, in irritating flight, you name it. Star Wars 8 tried to change these things for the Star Wars franchise by first time showing laser shots, not moving straight, but moving in a parabolic curve. We never had that in Star Wars. For example, this is a formal divergence. A content divergence is when anything happens within the content of a show or of a movie. This is, again, referring to Star Wars. This is the erratic behavior of the character Luke Skywalker in Episode 8, as one example. There are many more. We can talk about it if you wish. And now about gaming. Well, I've already told you what happened with Sonic the Hedgehog. This is, of course, a formal decision, originally creating him this way, then switching back to that way. I just looked it up. They say it cost about $5 million to redesign the character. I seriously doubt that. I think it's more, we're more talking about $15 to $20 million to reshoot scenes, to redesign the character, and to release the movie even at in a later point of time. But I don't think shareholders like if these things get too expensive, and therefore it was the official figure was given $5 million. I think it was way more. We don't have $5 million, not even $5 million, to create something like this or to correct something like this. So this is an older example from a franchise from, I think they started in 2005 with Jak and Daxter. Anybody played that? Yeah, okay. I picked this example because I was irritated by part 2. You remember the first part, what there was a decent, lovely jump and run game, in open world game, nice environment, kids friendly. Okay, and now look at part 2. Where is he holding the big gun? So they shifted the whole game design from child-friendly jump and run with a little squirrel. Well, the squirrel is back in part 2, but the rest of the game has changed dramatically. I think he even was, Jak was even depicted as being shell-shocked and having spent time in prison. So totally different gameplay. The game still did good, but I'm not really sure if it was a good decision to have the overall game design shifted that dramatically from here to here. I'm not really sure about that, but I wanted to bring the example just because for me it was an irritation, because I had played part 1 together with my wife, who loved the first game. Then I got her part 2. I was already looking at the box shot and said, big gun, I don't really know. And we played it, and we didn't really have a good time with it because it was more or less an open world shooter with jump and run elements in it. 3 and 4, well, you can see the design. They didn't change too much about it. And this is my main example, Dead Space. You remember this? Anybody played it? Anybody played it without being afraid? No. Part 1, deep space exploration horror game within a very close, dark environment on a, I think it was a mining space station somewhere in deep space. Our character, Isaac Clarke, was a psychologically unstable person, fighting with his own demons, as well as with the creatures the game threw at him in a very dark and close environment. Part 2, I think it was, I don't remember that too clearly because I think it was rather short in comparison to the first one, but it was more of the same, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Part 3, anybody played that? Yeah. And this was, again, frustrating for me, and I think for a lot of players. I looked some opinions up online. The whole setting changed. No more space station, no more darkness, no more character Isaac Clarke being alone against the masses of monsters the game threw at him. It was a cooperative game. It gave him an NPC to interact with, and the whole game was set on an ice world in broad daylight. And I'm not sure if this was originally really meant to be a Dead Space game. I think it wasn't. I think it was a different kind of game, and they just patched the graphics of Dead Space 1 and 2 onto a different environment, used Isaac Clarke again for the game design, to have Dead Space, and then very prominent Dead Space name logo on the box, and to get it out to the public. And I think it was not really a good decision, because here again we have lots of frictions, not on a story level, because they did continue the story, but on the personal level of the character, who all of a sudden was mentally very stable in comparison to part 1 and 2. It didn't have any issues. It was your average action hero character. So what happened to the riddled, to the traumatized Isaac Clarke from part 1 and part 2? We don't know. Here he was an average action character you used to move yourself, to move through the environment and to kill the monsters, which also appeared all of a sudden out of snow. I don't know what they thought about. And this is, well, as I said, things are getting complicated. There are different strategies how to handle divergence. Sometimes story parts come up like in Dead Space, where they told us, well, he crashed on a planet and now he has a friend, and now they have to get off the planet. Okay, this is story-wise. Other franchises just create a different universe to play around with. Okay, and I see my time's up. The only thing I just wanted to leave you with is, in my master thesis, I came up with a small tool to make these divergences visible. And this is what it looks like. It's a 3-dimensional tool using several icons to depict what is going on within your franchise. Let's just skip this and go right to the example. This is the WPC triangle. I call this WPC triangle. This is the one created for Dead Space. And what we can see here, I identified four issues with the game, 4 divergences. First of all, the planetary setting. This is a production decision which also affects the game world. So therefore, I put the first icon here on the production world axis, right in the middle, because I think these 2 issues are rather balanced, and it's a formal decision. It doesn't, well, it also could also have something to do with the content, but it's generally, it's an issue happening between the production level and the world level. Isaac Clarke's slight differently personality. Well, he's a totally changed character now. This is a character issue, and it's also on the story level. We have cooperative gameplay in contrast to the first games placing you alone into hell. This is a production issue because the production design was changed, and it also had influence on the characters because it's not a horror game anymore, it's an action game. So I placed this icon here, and it influences form and content of the game. So the content is different, and also the form, because you're in a light-riddled environment and not in the dark. And of course, more action, less horror. Production decision inflicts on the world, but mostly production decision. And this is also something which impacts on the content of the game. So this is just a slight overview of what I've been doing the last year when writing my master thesis. And well, I wanted to leave you with some do's and don'ts. We can talk about this later. Generally, I just wanted to tell you, think before you create your franchise, think before you create your stories, because if you want a franchise, you have to create a bigger world than if you just want to create one game. And I think this is, again, what happened in Dead Space, because they wanted to create one game and the setting was perfect, and then they made a franchise out of it. And that didn't work so well because the third part killed the franchise pretty much. They're currently doing a remake, but not a new game. Yeah, makeups, and this is from I'm not really sure if it was Arthur C. Clarke or if it was Harlan Ellison, but a famous science fiction writer once said in an interview, in science fiction, you can make up pretty much anything you want, but you have to stick with it later on. And this is what you need to have in mind when creating a world. Okay, and this is what I want to leave you with, because these divergences, they can be risks and things can go off the rails, but also they can be big chances. There have been examples just in the last few months and in the last few years where franchises got refreshed by daring and unusual decisions. I just want to name one movie, which was Joker from 2019. Maybe one or the other has seen it. Because this movie does pretty much everything wrong with the character Joker, but the movie is great, I think. And I mean, I think they got an Oscar for it, so it must have been at least partly good. So I really like this movie, and this is where divergences occur every other minute, because nothing matches with the Batman history of the DC comic books, but still the movie is a huge success also. Not only financially, but also on the art level. Okay, that was it. Yeah, these are other examples where things went okay. And that's it from my presentation. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Ralph. Thanks.